You've been looking forward to it all week. Maybe it's a creative project, maybe it's finally organizing your space, maybe it's learning something you genuinely care about. You have time, you have energy, you actually want to do it. And yet, when the moment comes, you don't start. You open your laptop, stare at the screen, and somehow end up doing something else entirely. This isn't about laziness. It's not about lacking discipline or motivation. It's about how your brain evaluates the immediate future and what it's actually trying to protect you from. The standard explanation is that you're procrastinating because the task is unpleasant. But that doesn't fit here. You're not avoiding something you dread. You're avoiding something you chose, something you've been thinking about with genuine interest. The confusion comes from assuming that wanting to do something means your brain is ready to do it. But wanting and starting are managed by completely different systems in your mind, and they don't always communicate well. When you imagine doing the task, your brain focuses on the end result, the finished project, the organized room, the skill you'll have learned. That vision feels good. It generates real enthusiasm. But when it's time to actually begin, your brain shifts its attention to something else entirely, the immediate cost of starting. Not the task itself, but the transition into it. Research on decision-making shows that our brains are extraordinarily sensitive to immediate effort, even when that effort is small. It's not the total work involved that creates resistance. It's the mental load of switching from your current state into a new one. Right now, you're in a known state. Your mind understands what you're doing, even if you're doing nothing. Starting the task means entering uncertainty, even if it's a task you've done before. Your brain has to load new information, make decisions, manage attention differently. That shift requires energy, and your brain treats that energy cost as a threat. This is where it gets uncomfortable. The resistance you feel isn't really about the task. It's about the gap between where your mind is now and where it needs to be to engage with the work. That gap might only be 30 seconds of actual effort, opening the document, getting the supplies out, pulling up the tutorial. But your brain experiences that 30 seconds as a cost to be avoided, and it will offer you alternatives that don't require the same shift. Checking your phone doesn't require a transition. Scrolling doesn't require setup. It keeps you in the same mental state you're already in. The same applies to reorganizing your desk for the third time, or suddenly deciding you need to clean your keyboard, or reading articles about productivity instead of actually being productive. These activities create the illusion of forward movement without demanding the cognitive shift that starting requires. You can see this play out in how you move through your day. You'll spend 2 hours thinking about starting a task that would take 20 minutes to complete. You'll refresh the same websites, rearrange items on your desk, make another cup of coffee you don't want. None of these activities are satisfying, but they also don't require you to change states. They keep you in a low-demand holding pattern. Your brain isn't choosing pleasure over work. It's choosing the known over the unknown. The pattern becomes clearer when you notice what happens after you finally do start. Once you're 10 minutes in, the resistance usually fades. The task stops feeling hard. Sometimes it even feels easier than you expected. This reveals something important. The difficulty wasn't in the task itself. It was in the starting. Your brain's threat assessment was about the transition, not the work. But by the time you realize that, you've already lost hours to avoidance. There's a secondary layer that makes this worse. When you repeatedly fail to start something you want to do, you begin to create a new association. The task becomes linked not just with effort, but with the feeling of failing to start it. Every time you think about it and don't begin, you're adding emotional weight, guilt, frustration, self-judgment. Now the task carries all of that, and your brain has even more reason to avoid the transition. You're not just starting the project, you're starting the project you've failed to start 5 times before. This is why the cycle can continue even when you have genuine interest. The wanting doesn't go away, but the friction keeps building. You might even notice that you can start other things more easily, things you care about less, because they don't carry the same accumulated weight. The low-stakes task has a clear transition. The meaningful task has become emotionally complicated. What makes this particularly difficult is how it interacts with your schedule. You tell yourself you'll start when you have a full afternoon free, or when you're more alert, or when conditions are perfect. But research on task initiation suggests that waiting for ideal conditions often reinforces avoidance. Your brain learns that the task requires special circumstances, which makes the transition feel even more significant. The perfect moment becomes another form of delay. You can observe this in the difference between tasks you start immediately and tasks you postpone. When something has a hard external deadline, or when someone else is waiting, the transition cost doesn't disappear, but your brain's calculation changes. The cost of not starting becomes greater than the cost of the transition. This is why you can write an email to a colleague in 2 minutes, but spend days avoiding an email you want to write to a friend. The content might be similar, but the perceived urgency shifts how your brain weighs the effort. Here's what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you don't actually want to do the thing. It doesn't mean the task isn't right for you, or that you should give up on it. And it definitely doesn't mean you lack some fundamental quality that other people have. The mechanism at work here is completely normal. It's your brain doing what brains do, trying to minimize effort and avoid uncertainty. The problem is that this system doesn't distinguish between threats that matter and transitions that don't. It also doesn't mean the solution is to simply push harder or rely on willpower. If the resistance is about the cost of transitioning, then forcing yourself through it repeatedly just reinforces the idea that starting is painful. You end up in the same place, with the same friction, the next time the opportunity comes up. The battle between intention and resistance becomes familiar, almost comfortable in its predictability. What it does mean is that the feeling you get, that heavy blankness, when you try to start, isn't a reflection of your character. It's a reflection of how your brain is calculating cost in that specific moment. The calculation is often wrong. The transition is rarely as hard as it feels, but the feeling is real and it's powerful and it shapes your behavior more than your intentions do. You can notice this in other people too, once you know what to look for. The colleague who keeps talking about the side project they never begin. The friend who buys supplies for a hobby and then doesn't use them. The person who has 10 tabs open for an online course they keep meaning to start. These aren't signs of weakness or broken follow-through. They're signs of the same mechanism running in the background, creating the same invisible resistance at the point of starting. The strangest part is how invisible this process is. While it's happening, you experience it as a vague sense of not being ready, or not having enough time, or needing to do something else first. Your brain generates plausible-sounding reasons for the delay. It feels like decision-making. But underneath, it's just the transition cost being processed as a reason not to begin. The narrative you tell yourself about why you're not starting is often just retroactive justification for a calculation that happened beneath conscious awareness. Some of the tasks you've been meaning to start will never get started, not because they weren't worth doing, but because the friction became too great, or the moment passed, or life moved in a different direction. That's not failure, that's just how time works. But some of them are still there, still waiting, still something you actually want to do. The question isn't whether you're capable, you already know you are. The question is whether you can see the resistance for what it is, not a judgment on the task or on you, but a misjudgment by a system that's trying to conserve energy in a world that no longer requires that kind of conservation. You don't need to fight it or fix it. You just need to recognize it. Because once you see the gap between wanting and starting, you stop assuming the gap means something is wrong. Sometimes, it just means your brain hasn't made the switch yet. And sometimes, that's all it is. The space between intention and action isn't always meaningful. Sometimes it's just mechanical, a feature of how attention and energy are allocated in a mind that's managing far more than any single task. Understanding that doesn't make starting easier, but it does make the difficulty feel less personal. And that shift, small as it seems, changes how you relate to everything you've been meaning to begin.